Imagine this, you're a woman in 1870s Kansas and your husband dies unexpectedly, leaving you with 3 children and a failing homestead. You have no legal right to inherit his land, no way to earn a living wage, and winter is approaching. Your only options are to remarry immediately to any man who will have you or face destitution and potentially lose your children to the state. The romanticized vision of the American frontier often overlooks the brutal realities faced by women who ventured west. While men sought fortune and freedom, women encountered a harsh world where their basic rights, safety, and dignity were routinely sacrificed to survival. From deadly childbirth without medical care to human trafficking disguised as mail-order bride services, these are the horrific realities that were simply accepted as normal for women in the Wild West. Starting with childbirth. On the American frontier, pregnancy was essentially a death sentence disguised as a blessing. The average woman gave birth 6 to 8 times during her reproductive years, each delivery a potential funeral. In remote territories, 1 in 8 women died from childbirth complications, their graves marking homesteads across the plains, like grim monuments to maternal sacrifice. No trained doctors existed for hundreds of miles. Women relied on neighbouring settlers or aging midwives whose medical knowledge consisted of folk remedies and prayers. When labour began, a woman's survival depended entirely on luck and the kindness of strangers who might arrive in time to help. Sarah McKinney learned this brutal truth in February 1876. Living on an isolated Colorado Territory homestead, she went into labour during a vicious blizzard that buried their cabin in snowdrifts. Her husband desperately rode 40 miles through the storm to fetch the nearest midwife, his horse struggling through waist-deep snow as Sarah's screams echoed through the howling wind. When he finally returned after 2 days, leading the exhausted midwife on horseback, they found Sarah's lifeless body in the cabin. She had bled to death alone, her newborn infant crying weakly beside her cold corpse. The 3 surviving McKinney children huddled in the corner, too terrified to approach their mother's body. Neighbours later took them in, adding 3 more mouths to their already struggling households. This scene repeated itself countless times across the frontier. Women continued their back-breaking work until the very moment labour began. They hauled water, tended livestock, and cooked meals even while experiencing contractions. Bed rest was a luxury that could mean starvation for the family. Infection claimed as many lives as hemorrhaging. Without proper sanitation, childbed fever spread rapidly through women's bodies, burning them alive from the inside. Breech births meant almost certain death for both mother and child. Women faced each pregnancy knowing they might never see their existing children grow up. The frontier demanded everything from women, including their lives. While their husbands dreamed of striking gold or claiming land, women understood that their greatest gamble wasn't with fortune or adventure. Every time they became pregnant, they were betting their lives on a game where the house always held the advantage. Trafficking. The romanticized notion of mail-order brides concealed one of the frontier's darkest enterprises. Organized human trafficking operations that fed on desperate women seeking better lives. Unscrupulous agents preyed on poverty-stricken families in eastern cities and foreign countries, promising respectable employment in the growing Western territories while delivering women into sexual slavery. The hurdy-gurdy girls of Montana represented this deception on an industrial scale during the 1860s and 1870s. Recruiters swept through immigrant neighborhoods in New York and Boston, targeting young women whose families could barely afford bread. They painted vivid pictures of dignified work as seamstresses, teachers, or domestic servants in prosperous mining towns where women were scarce and respected. 23-year-old Elena Kowalski believed these lies in 1869 when she signed her contract in a cramped Manhattan tenement. The recruiter, dressed in fine clothes and speaking of Montana's opportunities, promised her steady wages and eventual passage home to Poland for her entire family. Elena's parents, watching their daughter waste away from hunger, tearfully blessed her journey west. The reality struck Elena when her train reached Helena. Armed men herded her and 15 other women directly from the railroad platform into a saloon basement. Their contracts, written in English none of them could read, bound them to work off transportation debts that grew larger each month through invented expenses. Food, lodging, clothing, and medical care all accumulated charges that ensured years of bondage. Elena discovered her true purpose that first night when customers began arriving. Refusal meant beatings, starvation, or being sold to even more brutal establishments in remote mining camps. The women lived in windowless rooms, watched constantly, their movements restricted to the saloon's confines. Chinese women faced even more systematic trafficking through San Francisco's ports. Ah Toy arrived in 1849, sold by her desperate family during a famine that killed her younger siblings. She was 20 years old, promised work as a seamstress for wealthy American families. Instead, ship captains delivered her directly to California's goldfields, where miners paid premium prices for female companionship. Her captors created elaborate debt structures that made freedom impossible. Transportation costs, food, shelter, and protection fees multiplied monthly, ensuring permanent servitude. Ah Toy watched countless women die from disease, violence, or suicide, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves behind mining camps. Law enforcement officers either participated in these operations or deliberately ignored them. Sheriff departments received regular payments to maintain blindness to obvious trafficking activities. The frontier's isolation and lawlessness created perfect conditions for this modern slavery to flourish. These women's dreams of prosperity became nightmares of exploitation, their hopes for better lives transformed into desperate prayers for survival in a land that consumed them without mercy. Violence. The frontier operated under an unspoken code that placed women's bodies firmly under male authority, creating a landscape where violence against them was not only tolerated, but actively protected. Domestic brutality was considered a private family matter beyond the reach of community intervention. Women who suffered beatings had nowhere to turn, trapped in a system that viewed their husbands' fists as legitimate tools of household management. Mary Wilson discovered this horrifying truth in Hays City, Kansas, during the spring of 1869. Her husband Thomas had been drinking heavily since losing their crops to locusts, his rage intensifying with each failed harvest. The beatings began with slaps across her face for overcooking dinner, escalating to punches when she questioned his gambling debts. On May 15th, Thomas's fury reached its deadly climax. Neighbours heard Mary's desperate screams echoing across the prairie as he struck her repeatedly with an axe handle, her pleas for mercy mixing with the sickening crack of splintering bones. When the sounds finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the settlement. Sheriff Coleman arrived hours later to find Mary's battered corpse sprawled across the cabin floor, her skull crushed beyond recognition. Thomas sat calmly at their kitchen table, blood still staining his knuckles, casually explaining that his wife had become disobedient and required correction. Coleman nodded sympathetically, declaring the matter a domestic dispute beyond his jurisdiction. Within 2 months, Thomas had remarried a 16-year-old girl whose family desperately needed his modest property. No charges were ever filed, no investigation conducted. Mary Wilson's murder became just another forgotten tragedy in a territory where women's lives held less value than livestock. Violence stalked women from multiple directions on the frontier. Native American war parties specifically targeted women during raids, viewing them as valuable captives for ransom or slavery. Even more terrifying, vigilante justice frequently turned against women themselves when accusations of adultery or witchcraft arose. Elizabeth Taylor learned this lesson fatally in New Mexico Territory during 1885. Her husband's business partner, Samuel Brennan, accused her of conducting an affair while spreading rumours of her moral corruption throughout their settlement. Without any evidence beyond Brennan's word, a mob of 15 men surrounded the Taylor cabin one moonless night. They dragged Elizabeth from her bed as she screamed protests of innocence, her nightgown tearing as rough hands bound her arms. The makeshift noose went around her neck within minutes, her feet kicking desperately as the rope tightened. She died gasping denials that no one bothered hearing. Months later, evidence surfaced proving Brennan had fabricated everything to seize the Taylor family's valuable mining claim. Elizabeth's murder had been orchestrated for profit, her reputation destroyed to justify her execution. The frontier's twisted justice had claimed another innocent victim. Economics. The frontier's economic system treated women as financial dependents rather than contributors, stripping them of property rights and forcing them into economic servitude that often proved more devastating than physical violence. Married women could not own land, inherit property, or control their own earnings. When husbands died, their widows frequently discovered they had no claim to homesteads they had worked for decades. Martha Henderson faced this crushing reality in Wyoming Territory during the brutal winter of 1872. Her husband Jacob had collapsed while hauling timber, his heart giving out after years of back-breaking labour on their homestead. Martha had spent 15 years beside him, clearing fields, building fences, and raising livestock that sustained their family through countless hardships. 3 days after Jacob's funeral, creditors arrived at Martha's door with documents bearing official seals. The land belonged to the bank, they explained coldly, along with all livestock, equipment, and stored grain. Jacob had borrowed against the property during the previous year's drought, signing agreements that made Martha's contributions meaningless in the eyes of territorial courts. Within a week, Martha stood helpless as strangers loaded her family's possessions onto wagons. Her 4 children clung to her skirts, not understanding why their home was disappearing before their eyes. The creditors offered Martha a cruel choice: surrender her children to work off the family's remaining debts, or watch them starve during the approaching winter. Martha's youngest son, barely 8 years old, was indentured to a cattle rancher who promised to work him until his 18th birthday. Her daughters were sent to different households as domestic servants, their childhood sacrificed to pay debts they had never incurred. Martha herself became a labourer in the town's laundry, earning barely enough to rent a corner in someone else's shed. For women seeking independent income, the frontier offered few options beyond teaching or prostitution. Teaching positions paid $25 monthly when available, barely enough for basic survival. Male teachers earned more than double that amount for identical work, justified by the belief that women were merely supplementing family income rather than supporting themselves. This economic desperation drove countless women into Tombstone's brothels during the early 1880s. The so-called soiled doves faced a different kind of death sentence than frontier wives. Disease, violence, and despair claimed their lives with ruthless efficiency, their average lifespan reaching only 27 years. These women understood that every night could be their last, whether from a customer's knife, a competitor's poison, or their own laudanum overdose. They lived in constant fear, their bodies commodities in a marketplace that consumed them without conscience. The frontier's promise of opportunity applied only to men. For women, economic survival meant choosing between different forms of exploitation, each path leading toward the same inevitable destruction of dignity, health, and hope: medicine. The frontier's approach to women's health combined ignorance with outright malice, creating a medical landscape where treatments were often more deadly than the ailments they claimed to cure. Patent medicines containing mercury, arsenic, and toxic levels of alcohol flooded Western settlements, marketed specifically to women suffering from menstrual pain, pregnancy complications, and emotional distress. These supposed remedies transformed minor health issues into death sentences. Dr. Kilmer's female remedy epitomised this dangerous quackery during the 1870s and 1880s. Advertisements promised relief from women's troubles through a miracle tonic that would restore feminine vitality and cure hysteria. The elegant bottles, adorned with testimonials from grateful customers, concealed a poisonous mixture of lead and mercury that slowly destroyed internal organs while claiming to heal them. Rebecca Stone discovered this horrifying truth in Nebraska during 1878. The 32-year-old homesteader had been experiencing severe menstrual pain that prevented her from completing essential farm work. Her husband purchased Dr. Kilmer's remedy from a travelling salesman who guaranteed miraculous results within weeks of regular use. Rebecca began taking the prescribed doses 3 times daily, initially feeling relief from her cramping as the medicine's alcohol content numbed her pain. However, within a month, new symptoms emerged that terrified her more than the original discomfort. Her hands trembled uncontrollably while milking cows, her vision blurred during simple tasks, and her mind wandered during conversations with neighbours. The mercury was systematically poisoning her nervous system, causing irreversible brain damage that manifested as confusion, memory loss, and violent mood swings. Rebecca's husband, believing the medicine was helping, continued forcing the doses down her throat, even as she began having seizures that left her unconscious for hours. By the 3rd month, Rebecca could no longer recognise her own children. She wandered their homestead in a daze, talking to people who existed only in her deteriorating mind. Her body began shutting down as mercury accumulated in her liver and kidneys, causing organ failure that no frontier doctor understood or could treat. Rebecca died in agony, her final moments filled with hallucinations and convulsions. The local doctor recorded her death as female hysteria, completely unaware that the supposed cure had murdered her more efficiently than any disease. Mental health treatments proved equally barbaric. Women were routinely committed to territorial asylums for reading too many books, expressing political opinions, or disagreeing with their husbands' decisions. Mary Packard experienced this nightmare in Dakota Territory during 1879 when her husband had her institutionalized for opposing his business ventures. The asylum's water treatments involved submerging Mary in freezing water for hours, supposedly to calm her rebellious female nature. She endured 2 years of systematic torture disguised as medical care, her spirit broken by doctors who viewed independent thinking as a mental illness requiring violent correction.